Story number 1.
The first time I noticed something strange at the cabin, it was a cold, dark winter midnight. The kind of night where the wind howls like a wolf and the snow falls relentlessly, carpeting the world in white silence. My husband and I had been driving for hours through the winding back roads, heading to an isolated cabin we had rented for a weekend getaway. We were looking forward to the peace and seclusion, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin was charming in a rustic, worn-down way. It sat tucked away in the woods, with only the occasional distant neighbor, far enough that you couldn't see their lights through the trees, the kind of place you dream of when you want to escape. We unloaded our bags, started a fire in the stone hearth, and settled in with mugs of hot chocolate. I remember the quietness. It wasn't the usual peace that comes with isolation. It was oppressive, like the world had been muted by a thick blanket of snow. I tried not to think too much about it, telling myself it was just the storm outside causing the eerie stillness. We ate dinner in the small kitchen, and as the night wore on, we finally decided to retire for bed. The cabin had a narrow hallway with 2 bedrooms tucked off to the side. My husband went to the room on the left, while I took the one on the right. Both rooms had windows that looked out over the forest. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, listening to the wind, the occasional crackle of the fire, and the soft sighs of my husband as he drifted into sleep. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint tapping. It was so soft that I almost dismissed it as the wind or the trees brushing against the cabin, but then it came again, this time more distinct. Tap, tap. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound seemed to be coming from the window, just beyond the thin curtains. I told myself it was nothing, probably the snow or an animal, but something about it made me uneasy. My curiosity got the best of me, and I cautiously slipped out of bed, tiptoeing toward the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The snowstorm had intensified, and the world outside was shrouded in a white haze. But through the heavy snowfall, I could see the faint outline of something in the yard, something standing there, still as a statue, a figure. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no clothing, just the shape of a person standing in the yard facing the cabin. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but when I looked again, the figure was gone, disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the snowy dark. I thought about waking my husband, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. It had to be my imagination, right? Maybe the wind had made something look like a person in the distance. After all, there was no one out there. There couldn't be, not in a storm like this. I turned away from the window and returned to bed, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease, but I couldn't. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, the unsettling thought of someone or something outside gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept telling myself to relax, but sleep never came. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, but that's when it happened again. The tapping. Only this time it wasn't coming from the window. It was louder, closer, and it was coming from the door. Tap, tap, tap. I woke with a start, my breath shallow and my heart racing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out if I was just imagining it, but there was no mistaking the sound. It was real. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door, unable to move. I was paralyzed with fear. The wind outside had grown even stronger, and the storm was at its peak. The tapping grew more insistent, rhythmic, like something was trying to get in. I could hear it in my bones. Tap, tap, tap. It went on for several minutes until I finally found the strength to move. Slowly, cautiously, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, and my mind raced with every worst-case scenario I could think of. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. No one was there. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the walls now. Soft, scraping sounds like nails gently dragging across the wood. I glanced nervously at my husband, who was still fast asleep, unaware of the terror that had overtaken me. I looked around the hallway, trying to see where the sound was coming from. It was faint, distant, but it was there. Something wasn't right. I felt it deep in my gut. The house, the walls, everything felt wrong, as though it was alive in a way it shouldn't be. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get out of the cabin, but I couldn't bring myself to wake my husband. He would think I was just being paranoid. Instead, I forced myself to turn back to the door, but just as I reached for it, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was clear. Get out. The blood drained from my face. My heart pounded in my chest. The voice had been so clear, so unmistakable, that I couldn't ignore it. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my legs shaking with every step. I ran to the front door, my mind reeling. I had to get out, had to leave. But when I reached the door, I froze. The door was locked. I knew I had locked it earlier before we went to bed. But now it was as if someone had been inside. I turned the key in the lock and threw the door open. The wind outside was violent, battering against the house, but I didn't care. I stepped out into the snow, my breath coming in frantic gasps. The figure was gone now, but the sense of being watched, of being pursued, never left. I looked around, my flashlight sweeping the dark expanse of the yard, but there was no sign of anyone. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for something to happen. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of dread lingered, thick in the air. I ran back inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I woke my husband then, shaking him violently, urging him to wake up. He groggily sat up, confused, as I told him everything about the tapping, the voice, the figure outside. He listened quietly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He told me it was just the storm, the wind playing tricks on my mind, but I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. We spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room with the fire burning low. The storm didn't stop until the morning, and when daylight finally broke through, I was relieved to see the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting away the darkness. But even after the storm cleared, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us from the woods. I didn't sleep that night, and when we left the cabin the next morning, I couldn't get away fast enough. We never returned to that cabin. The owner called a few days later to ask how our stay had been, but I didn't answer. There was something about that place, something I couldn't explain, that still haunts me to this day. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as Maya's car crawled along the deserted mountain road. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the knuckles pale against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She had left the small family gathering later than expected, underestimating how fast the storm would roll in. Now she was alone in the middle of nowhere, the forested road stretching endlessly ahead. The radio crackled with static, and even the emergency broadcast frequency was silent. Her phone sat useless on the passenger seat, the signal dead for miles. Maya muttered to herself, trying to stay calm, her breath fogging up the windshield despite the heater working overtime. The road was slick with ice, and the car's tires occasionally slipped, forcing her to slow even more. She glanced at the clock again. 12:03 a.m. Midnight. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, dressed in a long, pale coat, her face partially obscured by the falling snow. She didn't wave or call for help. She simply stood there, staring at Maya's approaching car. Maya's heart raced. She wasn't the type to stop for strangers in the middle of the night, especially in a storm, but something about the woman's stillness was unsettling. She slowed the car to a crawl and rolled down the window slightly, just enough to speak. "Do you need help?" Maya called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just stared, her dark eyes locked onto Maya's. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the headlights, and her breath didn't fog in the icy air. Maya felt a chill creep up her spine. Something was wrong. "Are you okay?" She tried again, louder this time. The woman raised an arm, pointing down the road, her expression unchanged. It wasn't a plea for help, nor a gesture of gratitude. It was mechanical, deliberate. Maya hesitated, then nodded, rolling up the window and driving on. Her rear-view mirror showed the woman standing in the same spot, unmoving, as her car disappeared into the swirling snow. She couldn't shake the image of the woman. There was no car nearby, no sign of anyone else. What was she doing out here, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a storm? Her unease deepened as she drove. The road seemed endless, the trees pressing in from both sides. The snow was relentless, and the clock now read 12:20 a.m. She hadn't seen another car or sign of life since she'd left the woman behind. Then she saw it again, another figure standing by the roadside. No, not another. It was the same woman, her pale coat and haunting stare unmistakable. Maya's stomach dropped. She hadn't passed any turnoffs or side roads. It was impossible for the woman to be ahead of her. She slowed the car again, but this time she didn't stop. She kept her eyes on the figure as she passed, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge the car at all. Maya's headlights illuminated her face for a brief moment, and she could swear she saw the corners of the woman's mouth curl into the faintest hint of a smile. "Just keep driving," Maya muttered to herself, her voice shaking. "It's the storm playing tricks on you." But the sense of unease grew stronger. The air inside the car felt colder, despite the heater blasting at full power. Her breath fogged the windshield again, and she had to swipe at it with her sleeve to see. Her fingers felt numb, and she realized she was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her hands ached. The road twisted and turned, and for a while, she saw nothing but the endless snow and trees. She glanced at the clock again, 12:45 a.m. She was certain she should have reached the highway by now, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. Then she saw her again. The woman stood in the middle of the road this time, directly in the path of Maya's car. Maya slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy surface. The car came to a stop mere feet from the figure. The woman stood motionless, staring at her through the windshield. Maya's breath came in shallow gasps. She didn't dare move, didn't dare blink. The woman's dark eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and for a moment Maya was paralyzed with fear. The woman slowly raised her hand again, pointing to something behind Maya. Her movements were deliberate, almost unnatural. Maya didn't want to look, but some primal instinct forced her to glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, just the empty road disappearing into the snowstorm. When she turned back to the windshield, the woman was gone. Maya's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing. She had to get out of there. She pressed the gas pedal, the tires spinning briefly before finding traction. The car lurched forward, and she drove as fast as the icy road would allow. The road finally began to descend, and she felt a faint sense of relief. She recognized this stretch of highway. It wasn't far from the main junction. She kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the woman again, but the road behind her remained empty. At 1:15 a.m., she pulled into a small gas station at the edge of a quiet town. The snow had eased up, and the lights of the station were a welcome sight. Maya parked and stumbled out of the car, her legs trembling. She made her way inside, where a bored-looking attendant sat behind the counter. "You okay, miss?" the man asked, eyeing her pale face and shaking hands. I saw someone on the road," Maya stammered. "A woman. She kept appearing. I don't know how the attendant's expression darkened. "You saw her, didn't you?" Maya froze. "What do you mean?" The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "People around here call her the Midnight Woman. She's been seen on that stretch of road for decades. Some say she's the ghost of a hitchhiker who froze to death in a storm. Others say she's looking for something or someone." Maya felt her blood turn to ice. "Has anyone ever stopped for her?" The man nodded grimly. "A few. They say if you pick her up, she disappears before you reach town, but if you ignore her..." He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the window. "Well, you made it here. That's what matters." Maya didn't stay long. After filling her tank, she got back in her car and drove the remaining miles home. She didn't see the woman again, but for weeks afterward, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she drove at night, she found herself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those dark eyes staring back at her. She never spoke of the Midnight Woman again. But on snowy winter nights when the roads are quiet and the wind howls through the trees, she can still feel the chill of that haunted stretch of highway. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The winter of 2007 was one of the coldest I had ever experienced. I was driving back to my hometown after spending Christmas with a friend in the countryside. The roads were desolate, lined with snow-covered trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The clock on my dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and the biting wind howled outside, shaking my little car as I drove through the winding, isolated back roads. I wasn't supposed to take this route, but a detour sign had forced me off the main highway. My GPS lost signal miles back, and the sense of isolation began to weigh heavily on me. The snow started falling harder, and soon my headlights illuminated only a few feet of the road ahead. I was trying to focus on the icy road when I spotted a figure standing by the side, just beyond the reach of my high beams. I slowed down instinctively, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was a woman dressed in a long white coat that blended almost seamlessly with the snow. She stood motionless, her face obscured by the shadows of the trees. Something about her presence sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I rolled down my window slightly, enough to speak. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were examining me. The movement was unnervingly slow, almost mechanical. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Against my better judgment, I pulled the car to a stop and stepped out, the freezing wind cutting through my jacket. "Do you need help?" I asked again, taking a cautious step toward her. She finally moved, raising one hand and pointing down the road. Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the wind. "There's an accident ahead. Be careful." I squinted in the direction she pointed, but all I could see was the swirling snow. "Are you hurt? Do you need a ride?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but they do." Before I could ask who she meant, she turned and began walking into the woods, her figure fading into the blizzard. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty, got the better of me. I climbed back into my car and drove cautiously down the road, scanning for any signs of an accident. About a mile ahead, I saw it. A car had skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. Its headlights were dim, and the front end was crumpled like a discarded soda can. I pulled over and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I approached the wreck. The snow muffled everything, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots. When I reached the car, my heart sank. Inside were two people, a man and a woman, both unconscious. The man was slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The woman's face was pale, her breath fogging up the cracked passenger window. I banged on the glass, hoping to rouse them, but they didn't stir. The dispatcher on the phone assured me that help was on the way, but the roads were bad and it would take time. I stayed by the car, trying to keep calm when I felt it, a presence behind me. Turning quickly, I saw her again, the woman in white. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her face clearer now. Her eyes were dark, and her expression was one of sorrow. "They'll be fine," she said softly, though I couldn't tell if she was speaking to me or herself. I blinked, and she was gone. The sound of sirens broke through the quiet not long after. Paramedics and police arrived, taking over the scene. I explained everything, how I found the car, how I'd seen the woman earlier. The officer taking my statement nodded, his face serious. "You're lucky you stopped," he said. "They wouldn't have lasted much longer in this cold." I hesitated, then asked, Do you think she knew about the accident? The woman I saw?" The officer's expression darkened. "What woman?" I described her. White coat, dark hair, haunting presence. And he exchanged a look with one of the paramedics. "You're not the first person to say they've seen her," he admitted. "There's a local legend about a woman who died on this road years ago in a snowstorm. She crashed her car and froze to death before anyone could find her." A chill ran down my spine. "So you think she—" The officer shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe she's still looking out for people, making sure they don't meet the same fate." I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see her again, but there was nothing, just the falling snow and the quiet hum of the rescue effort. As I drove away, the clock struck midnight and the snowstorm began to ease. I never drove that road again, but on cold winter nights I sometimes wonder if she's still out there, watching, waiting, guiding lost travelers through the darkness.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sharp sting of snow and ice. Alex tightened his scarf around his neck and kept walking, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen ground. It was close to midnight, and the storm had turned the winding country road into a white, featureless expanse. His car had broken down nearly an hour ago, and with no cell signal and no sign of help, he had no choice but to keep moving. The road stretched ahead of him, barely visible in the weak glow of his flashlight. The trees lining either side of the path were skeletal and looming, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Alex shivered, the cold seeping into his bones despite his heavy coat. His breath came out in clouds, the only sound other than the relentless wind. As he trudged forward, a faint light appeared in the distance. Relief washed over him. It looked like a house, its warm glow cutting through the blizzard. He quickened his pace, his heart lifting at the thought of shelter and warmth. The house was small and old, its wooden exterior weathered and partially hidden by snowdrifts. A single lantern hung on the porch, swaying gently in the wind. Alex climbed the steps and knocked on the door, his gloved hand thudding dully against the wood. There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone home? My car broke down and I need help." The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. The warmth from inside was inviting, and Alex hesitated only a moment before stepping in. The room was modest, with a fireplace crackling in the corner and a worn rug covering the wooden floor. A rocking chair sat near the fire, its slow, rhythmic motion the only sign of movement. "Hello?" Alex called out again, his voice echoing slightly. "I don't mean to intrude, but my car?" His words trailed off as he noticed something strange. Despite the warmth of the fire, the air in the room felt cold, almost oppressive. The rocking chair creaked softly as it swayed back and forth, but there was no one sitting in it. A chill ran down Alex's spine. He moved further into the room, his boots leaving wet tracks on the floor. The walls were lined with faded photographs, their black and white faces staring down at him. Most were of a young woman, her delicate features framed by long, dark hair. She was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about her eyes, cold and piercing, as though they could see right through him. The sound of a door closing startled Alex, and he spun around. The front door had shut itself, and the room seemed darker than before. He tried to calm his racing heart, telling himself it was just the wind. As he turned back toward the fireplace, he froze. The rocking chair had stopped moving. The room was deathly silent now, the crackling fire reduced to faint embers. Alex felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as though he were being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Then he heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves. It came from the hallway leading deeper into the house. Alex hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave, but curiosity, or perhaps something else, compelled him forward. The hallway was narrow and dark, the faint glow from his flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. The whispering grew louder as he approached a door at the end of the hall. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into his skin. The door creaked open to reveal a small bedroom. The walls were bare, and the only furniture was an old wooden bed with a faded quilt. A woman sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and she appeared to be staring out the window at the snowstorm beyond. "Ma'am?" Alex said cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need help." The woman didn't respond. She sat completely still, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something only she could hear. Alex took a step closer. "Are you okay?" Slowly, the woman turned to face him. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light, and her eyes were just as they had been in the photographs, cold, piercing, and devoid of any warmth. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, the whispering returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around him, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Alex stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the temperature plummeted. His breath came out in ragged gasps, visible in the icy air. The woman stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She took a step toward him, and Alex's flashlight finally gave out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic overtook him, and he turned to flee. He sprinted down the hallway, the whispers following him like a chorus of unseen voices. He reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling out into the storm. The wind howled around him as he ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The light from the house faded behind him, swallowed by the blizzard. He didn't stop until he reached a clearing where the road was barely visible through the snow. Gasping for breath, Alex turned back to look at the house. It was gone. There was nothing but an empty field, the snow undisturbed. His footprints were the only evidence he had been there at all. Alex stood there, shaking, until the faint sound of an approaching engine snapped him out of his stupor. A snowplow emerged from the storm, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver stopped and rolled down the window, his face creased with concern. "You all right, son? What are you doing out here in this weather?" Alex could barely find his voice. There was a house. I went inside, and there was a woman." The driver frowned. "A house? Ain't been no houses on this stretch of road for years. You must have gotten turned around in the storm." Alex tried to protest, but the man shook his head. "You're lucky I found you. Folks have gotten lost out here and never made it back." As the driver gave him a lift to the nearest town, Alex couldn't shake the memory of the woman's eyes or the whispers that had filled the house. He never spoke of the experience again, but on cold winter nights when the wind howled through the valley, he couldn't help but wonder if she was still out there waiting. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The winter of 2012 was one of the harshest on record. I remember it clearly because that was the year I stayed at my uncle's remote cabin in the woods of northern Maine. He'd asked me to look after the place while he visited family out of state. It seemed like an ideal escape. No work obligations, no city noise, just peace and quiet. Or so I thought. The cabin was small but cozy, surrounded by dense pine trees that seemed to stretch forever. There was no cell service, and the nearest neighbor lived miles away. At first, I welcomed the solitude. I spent my days chopping firewood, reading, and sitting by the crackling fireplace. But as the days grew colder and the nights stretched longer, the isolation began to feel oppressive. It was a little after midnight on a particularly frigid evening when I first noticed something strange. I was lying on the couch, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like faint knocking. It wasn't on the door, it was coming from somewhere outside. At first I brushed it off, assuming it was the wind rattling a loose branch, but the sound persisted, steady and deliberate. I got up and grabbed my flashlight, pulling on my heavy coat before stepping onto the porch. The icy air stung my face, and the snow crunched under my boots as I scanned the tree line with the flashlight. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. I didn't see anything unusual, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next evening, as the snowstorm outside intensified, I sat by the fire trying to distract myself with a book. Around the same time as the night before, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder. It wasn't coming from the forest, it was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The back door led to a small shed and an overgrown path that wound deeper into the woods. Nobody should have been out there. Not in these conditions. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I slowly approached the back door. My breath fogged up the cold glass of the small window as I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, I saw them. Footprints. They led from the woods to the shed, stark and fresh in the deep snow. Heart pounding, I debated whether to investigate. My rational mind told me to stay inside and lock every door and window. But curiosity, or perhaps fear of the unknown, drove me to act. I slipped on my boots and stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I followed the trail. The footprints were strange. They were barefoot, the shape unmistakable, but they were too large to belong to any animal. Who would be walking barefoot in a snowstorm? The thought made my stomach churn. The trail ended at the shed, its wooden door hanging slightly ajar. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I pushed the door open. The shed was empty, filled only with old tools and bags of firewood. No footprints led away from it, just the single set leading in. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the switch, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When the light finally came back on, my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the snow just beyond the shed was a figure. It was a woman, pale and thin, with long black hair that hung in frozen strands around her face. She was wearing what looked like a thin white dress, completely inappropriate for the weather. Her eyes were hollow and dark, and her lips were an unnatural shade of blue. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with an expression that was neither angry nor sad, but something far worse: empty. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and when I looked again, she was gone. I ran back to the cabin, bolting the door and piling furniture in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light the fireplace. For hours, I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a fire poker, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. At some point, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed and sunlight streamed weakly through the frosted windows. I cautiously stepped outside to look around. The footprints were gone, erased by the fresh snowfall. The shed door was closed as if nothing had happened. But just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, etched into the thin layer of frost on the window, was a handprint. It was too large to be mine, and the fingers were long and spindly, the kind that didn't belong to anything human. I left the cabin that day, abandoning my uncle's instructions to stay. When I told him what happened, he was silent for a long time before finally saying, "You're not the first to see her." He explained that the land the cabin was built on had a dark history. Decades ago, a woman went missing during a brutal snowstorm. She'd been searching for her lost child, and her body was never found. Locals believed her spirit still wandered the woods, forever searching, forever lost. I haven't been back to the cabin since, but every winter when the nights grow long and the wind howls through the trees, I can't help but think of her, the woman in the snow, and the hollow emptiness of her gaze. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The winter of 2015 was unforgiving, with snowstorms sweeping across the Midwest. I was a young paramedic back then, stationed in a small town surrounded by endless fields and dense woods. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Calls were few and far between, but the ones we got often stuck with me. None more so than the one that came in on a bitterly cold midnight in January. I was working the night shift with my partner, Mike. The roads were treacherous, covered in black ice and fresh snow. The radio crackled to life just after midnight, and the dispatcher's voice came through, tense and urgent. Possible 1050, single vehicle rollover on County Road 14. Unknown injuries. Be advised, the road is nearly impassable. Mike and I exchanged a look. County Road 14 was notorious for accidents, especially in winter. It was a narrow, winding stretch of road flanked by dense woods on either side. The kind of place that seemed to swallow headlights and muffle sound. We climbed into the ambulance and set off. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, and the wind howled like a living thing. The drive felt endless, the world outside reduced to a blur of white and black. When we finally reached the scene, it was just as bad as we'd feared. A dark sedan had skidded off the road and rolled into the ditch. The car was upside down, its roof crumpled like a tin can. Steam rose from the engine, mixing with the swirling snow. I grabbed my flashlight and approached cautiously, calling out as I went. "EMS? Can you hear me? Is anyone inside?" There was no response. I crouched by the driver's side window, peering inside. The glass was shattered, and the interior was coated in frost. A woman was slumped over in the driver's seat, her head resting at an unnatural angle. My stomach sank. I reached for the door handle, but it was jammed, frozen solid. Mike joined me, and together we pried it open. The woman was in her mid-30s, dressed in a thin coat and jeans. Her lips were blue, her skin pale. I checked for a pulse, though I already knew what I'd find. She was gone. We worked in silence, securing the scene and calling it in. The snow was relentless, soaking through our uniforms and numbing our fingers. As I moved to the back seat to check for other passengers, something caught my attention. Footprints. They led away from the car into the woods, barefoot, deep in the snow, and impossibly small, like those of a child. "Mike," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "Do you see this?" He turned, his face pale in the beam of my flashlight. "What the hell? There's no way." The dispatcher had mentioned only one occupant. There hadn't been any reports of a missing child, and yet the footprints were there, leading into the trees. Against every ounce of common sense, I followed them. The woods were dark and eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your own breathing sound deafening. The footprints continued, perfectly spaced, as if the child had walked calmly and deliberately despite the freezing cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. "If you can hear me, call back. We're here to help." There was no response. Mike hesitated at the edge of the woods, shining his flashlight nervously into the darkness. "We shouldn't be out here," he muttered. "This is insane." He was right, but something compelled me to keep going. The footprints led deeper and deeper into the woods, and then suddenly they stopped. Just stopped, in the middle of a small clearing. There were no signs of struggle, no other tracks, just an empty patch of snow. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the trees. "Where did they go?" I whispered, and then I heard it. A soft, distant laugh. It was high-pitched and faint, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. It sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Mike grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't argue. We retraced our steps as quickly as we could, though the footprints leading into the woods seemed fainter, as if they were already being erased by the snow. When we reached the car, the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. As we waited for the tow truck and the coroner to arrive, Mike and I sat in the ambulance, saying little. The heater blasted warm air, but I couldn't stop shivering. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerge. The tow truck driver arrived first, a gruff older man who'd been working the area for decades. As he hooked up the wreck, I asked if he'd ever heard of anything strange happening on County Road 14. He paused, glancing at the woods with a wary expression. "You're not the first to ask that," he said. "There's a story about a woman who crashed her car out here years ago. They say she was driving her son to the hospital. He had a fever, bad one. She didn't make the turn, flipped her car. By the time anyone found them, it was too late." He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his weathered face. "Thing is, they only found her, never found the boy. Some folks say he's still out there, wandering, looking for someone to take him home." Mike and I didn't say a word. When the coroner arrived, we helped load the woman into the van. As we secured the scene and prepared to leave, I looked back one last time at the woods. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was still. Too still. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the faint glow of our headlights, stood a small figure, a child, barefoot, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. We never spoke of that night again. But every time I pass a snow-covered field or hear the soft crunch of boots on frost, I think of those footprints and that hollow, echoing laugh. And I wonder if he's still out there waiting for someone to take him home. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the coldest winter I'd ever experienced. The winds that howled through the trees outside my cabin made the walls groan and shudder. Snow had been falling relentlessly for days, and the world outside was a blur of white, soft, and endless. I had been staying in the cabin for about a week, enjoying the solitude and escape from the bustle of city life. The cabin was remote, nestled deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or civilization, a perfect place for someone looking to be alone, to rest and reset. I'd grown up in the country, and I wasn't unfamiliar with long, dark winter nights, the kind of nights where the darkness seemed to seep into everything, where the only sounds you could hear were the crackling of the fire or the occasional call of an owl. Still, this particular night felt different. The air was thick with something unexplainable, and a chill that went beyond the weather seemed to hang in the cabin. I had been reading a book, curled up by the fire with the wind pounding against the cabin's windows. The flames flickered in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I had just turned the page when I heard it, a faint noise. At first it was so quiet I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, an unmistakable sound of something scraping gently against the wooden floor. I froze, the book still in my hands. I held my breath, straining to hear. The house was empty, just me and the cold night. The noise continued, soft but insistent, coming from the hallway just outside the living room. It sounded like footsteps, slow, methodical, almost hesitant. But the floor in the cabin was old and creaky, and there was no way someone could move so quietly through it. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses made noises, didn't they? That's what I told myself as I sat there, tense, listening to the slow, measured footsteps that seemed to draw closer to the living room. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was definitely in the house with me. I stood up cautiously, placing my book down, my hands clammy with fear. I slowly made my way to the hallway, my feet barely making a sound against the creaky floorboards. As I walked toward the source of the noise, I could feel the temperature in the house drop even further. My breath formed tiny clouds in the air in front of me. The hallway was dark, only the dim light from the living room illuminating the edges. I walked slowly, my heart racing in my chest. As I reached the end of the hall, I hesitated for a moment, the fear gripping me in a way I couldn't explain. There was something so unnatural about the silence of the house, about the feeling of being watched. I turned the corner into the small back room. The room was empty, save for a few old chairs and a small desk. No one was there, no footsteps, no sounds. The room was still. I breathed out a sigh of relief, trying to calm my racing pulse. It was nothing, I told myself. It had to be nothing. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The window at the far end of the room was cracked open. Just a tiny gap, but enough for the wind to seep in, making the curtains rustle ever so slightly. I was certain I had closed that window when I arrived. No one else had been here. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning as I tried to make sense of it. I moved to the window, my breath coming out in short bursts. The snow outside had piled up against the glass, creating an eerie reflection. I shut the window quickly, as though the act would somehow erase the unease that had settled in my gut. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart pound even harder. I turned to head back to the living room, but then I heard it again. The sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper. A soft, almost breathless voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't coming from any one place. It seemed to echo in the air, filling the room with a cold, unearthly presence. My body went rigid, my muscles locking up with fear. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I felt as if the room was closing in around me. I tried to turn and run, but my feet felt heavy, like I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though something invisible was pressing against my chest. The whispering stopped. A deep silence followed, one that felt even more unnerving than the sound of the voice had been. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, now just outside the door. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth, waiting. I ran, not thinking, not stopping. My heart was a frantic drumbeat in my chest, and my legs moved before my mind could catch up. I reached the front door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't open. The door, which had opened easily just hours ago, was stuck. I slammed my shoulder into it, the panic rising as I felt trapped, the walls closing in on me. The footsteps were getting closer now, the floorboards creaking beneath the invisible presence. Finally, with one last push, the door opened, and I spilled out into the snow. The cold hit me like a wave, and I gasped for air as I stumbled out onto the porch. The snow was falling heavily, the ground covered in a thick layer, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. I ran down the driveway toward the road, the crunching of snow beneath my boots the only sound in the night. I glanced back at the cabin, expecting to see a shadow in the window, expecting to see someone or something watching me. But the cabin was empty, just a dark shape against the white backdrop of the snow. No sign of life. My heart still pounded as I made my way toward the main road, not stopping, not looking back. The wind was howling again, the storm growing stronger, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back to that cabin. Not tonight. I ended up staying in the small town for the rest of the night, at a local inn. When I woke up the next morning, I drove straight home, unable to shake the feeling that I had left something behind. When I returned to the cabin a week later to gather my things, everything was as I had left it. No sign of anyone else having been there, no footprints in the snow around the cabin, no sign of the whispering or the footsteps that had haunted me the week before. It was as though nothing had happened at all. But I knew the truth. Whatever had been in that cabin with me, whatever had been walking the halls, had never truly left. I never returned to that cabin again.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm had begun hours earlier, sweeping across the landscape with a ferocity that seemed unnatural for a typical winter night. The wind whistled through the trees, and the pale moonlight barely pierced through the thick clouds. I had driven up to my family's cabin on the outskirts of town, a place I had spent countless winters. Yet this night felt different. Something in the air was off, an unsettling quiet that even the storm couldn't seem to drown out. I had arrived late, just after midnight. The snow was so deep that my car had barely made it up the long gravel driveway, but I had finally parked it near the porch. I was alone, my husband away for work and my son visiting his grandparents for the weekend. The solitude was supposed to be comforting, a retreat from the rush of everyday life. I'd grown used to the silence here over the years, but tonight I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I stepped into the cabin, the familiar smell of pine and wood smoke greeted me. I locked the door behind me, and the warmth of the fire that crackled in the hearth welcomed me into the room. The cabin was cozy, small, with only a few rooms, but it had always felt like a second home. I unpacked my bag and decided to make myself a cup of tea before settling into the living room. It wasn't until I sat down by the fire, sipping the hot tea, that I noticed the noise. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, its howls growing louder as the storm intensified. But then I realized it wasn't just the wind. It was coming from upstairs, soft but distinct, a creaking like the sound of a door slowly opening and closing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The upstairs bedroom doors were never closed. They were old and heavy, and the hinges often squeaked, but they were solid. No wind could move them. I set my cup down on the table and listened closely. There it was again, the sound of something moving. A scraping, a shift of wood, like someone was walking around up there. I stood up, my legs heavy with unease. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, the sound of my steps echoing in the quiet house. My breath felt shallow, and a cold chill swept over me, as if the house itself had grown colder since I had entered. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stood still, straining to hear anything more. The noise had stopped, but I could feel the silence pressing in around me, suffocating. The hallway at the top was dark, save for the faint light from the living room behind me. I made my way to the first bedroom, the one on the right, where I always slept when I came alone. I pushed the door open and found it empty, just as I had left it. The bed was neatly made, and everything was in its place. I checked the other two rooms quickly. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The doors were all open, the same as they had been when I left them earlier. I felt foolish for getting worked up, for letting the wind outside get to me. It was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. I returned downstairs, but as I passed the hallway mirror on the way back, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection, I could swear I saw a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, standing still, just at the end of the hallway. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the better of me. I grabbed my tea again and tried to relax in front of the fire, but the strange sensation didn't leave. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the shutters banging softly against the walls. The house groaned, settling into the storm. I tried to focus on the comforting sound of the fire crackling, but something kept tugging at me, pulling my attention back to the darkened hallway. After a few minutes, I heard it again, the faint scraping sound from upstairs. It was quiet at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder and more distinct. I couldn't ignore it this time. My heart began to race, and I stood up, my legs unsteady. The house seemed to be holding its breath. I walked slowly toward the stairs, the floorboards creaking under my feet as I ascended. This time, I didn't stop at the top of the stairs. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom at the end. The door was slightly ajar, just as I had left it. I pushed it open slowly. The room was still, but the temperature had dropped. The air was thick with a presence I couldn't place. I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered, then went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My skin crawled with the sensation that something was very wrong. I moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains letting in a sliver of moonlight. The snow was still falling in sheets, and the world outside was blanketed in white. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something out in the distance, near the edge of the tree line, a figure standing motionless, staring toward the cabin. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained just a shadow in the storm. A chill ran through me as I stepped back from the window. I tried to shake it off, but the unease settled deeper within me. I hurried back downstairs, my pulse racing. I checked the doors, the windows, but everything seemed secure. I bolted the door and locked it tightly, the sound of the wind outside almost deafening now. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. But something kept me rooted to the spot, like an invisible force was holding me in place. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my husband, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the reception, leaving me even more isolated. Panic began to set in. I couldn't stay here. Not with the feeling that something was moving in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I retreated to the living room and turned on all the lights, hoping the warmth of the fire and the bright lights would push back the fear that had settled in my chest. But the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the cabin. Soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood coming from beneath the floorboards. I jumped up, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, more insistent. I ran to the window again, pulling the curtain back, and there it was. Out in the distance, the figure. It hadn't moved. It was still watching. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that it was no longer just a shadow. The figure was closer now, standing just at the edge of the porch, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I bolted from the cabin, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to get out. I didn't care about my things, about anything else. I needed to leave. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap in the face. I ran through the snow, slipping on the icy ground, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, but finally, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin. The storm passed, and the days that followed were clear and quiet, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the tapping, the figure, the overwhelming sense that something or someone was still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The night was still, the kind of stillness that pressed against your chest, making every breath feel like a struggle. Snow had fallen heavily, blanketing the world outside in an eerie, silent white. It was the middle of winter, and the clock had just struck midnight. Inside the old farmhouse, the wind howled around the corners of the house, sending sharp gusts against the windows. The wooden beams creaked and groaned, as if the house itself were alive, shifting with the cold. Maggie sat on the couch, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows in the room. She was alone for the weekend. Her husband had left to visit family in the city, leaving her to spend a quiet few days in their country home. She had thought the isolation would be a relief from the demands of work, but now, in the deep of the night, she wasn't so sure. The house was old, built in the 1800s, with a history that Maggie only half knew. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone who lived in the area had some story about the old farmhouse, the whispers of strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of your vision. But Maggie didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. The noises, the creaks, they were just part of an old house settling, right? Still, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. She had spent the last few hours curled up with a book, trying to distract herself from the dark corners of the house, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, where the snowstorm raged outside, and the darkness seemed to reach inward, pressing against the glass like something trying to get in. It wasn't the storm that made her uneasy, though. It was the feeling that something was in the house with her. She couldn't explain it, but every now and then, when the wind would gust, she could hear what sounded like footsteps above her, soft, deliberate steps that seemed to echo down the old wooden staircase. Maggie glanced toward the stairs, her heart racing for a moment, but then she told herself it was just the house. Old houses made noises. They settled. It was nothing, but the steps came again, louder this time, slow, methodical. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. There was no one upstairs. She was certain of that. She had checked every room before settling down for the night. She thought of calling her husband, but it was late. Too late. And besides, what would she tell him? That the house was making noises? He would laugh it off. He didn't believe in ghosts either. But this didn't feel like just the house. It felt like something more. Gathering her courage, Maggie stood up. She grabbed the nearest object she could find, an old, heavy candlestick, and made her way toward the staircase. Each step creaked under her feet as she climbed the narrow steps slowly, her heart thumping louder with every passing moment. She was almost at the top when she heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming from the hallway at the top of the stairs. Maggie froze, staring into the darkness. The house was so quiet now. She could hear the pounding of her heart, the only sound in the stillness, and the cold air that seemed to seep through the walls. She called out, her voice shaking. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The air grew colder, and she could see her breath forming a mist in front of her face. She shivered, her skin prickling with a sense of dread. And then from the darkness, she saw something, a shape, a shadow, moving slowly toward her. It was a woman, though the shape was indistinct, like smoke swirling in the dim light of the hallway. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This couldn't be happening. She was just tired, imagining things. That's all. But the figure was getting closer, and as it moved, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop even further, until Maggie could see her breath in front of her like a cloud of frost. The figure stopped a few feet away from her. Maggie couldn't move, her body frozen in place, her legs like lead. She could see the woman's face now, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the kind of dress from the early 1900s, torn at the edges as though it had been worn for a long time, and there was something about her that felt wrong, unnatural. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to beckon Maggie forward, pulling her toward her with an invisible force. Maggie wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Her feet moved on their own slowly, as though she was being drawn in against her will. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more, and the figure's eyes glowed faintly in the dark. The air felt thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The woman opened her mouth, and a voice, low and raspy, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Maggie's mind screamed in terror, but the words didn't come out. The house felt alive with the presence of the woman, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. She tried to step back, but her body moved only inches, as though it were stuck in place, unable to break free. The woman's voice echoed in her ears. "I've been waiting." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, and she struggled to breathe. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure stepped closer, her face now mere inches from Maggie's. She could feel the cold radiating from her like ice, and the stench of decay filled the air. "Leave," the woman rasped, "before it's too late." The last word echoed in the silence, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable level. Maggie's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and she knew she had to get out of there. She had to run, but when she tried to scream, her voice was lost in the freezing air. With a burst of panic, Maggie's body finally responded. She backed away from the figure, stumbling down the stairs and into the living room. The front door was still locked, and she had no way out. But when she turned back to look toward the stairs, the figure was gone. The house was quiet again, the only sound the wind howling outside. Maggie didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. The memory of the woman's eyes haunted her, and the words she had spoken reverberated in her mind over and over. "Leave before it's too late." In the morning, Maggie was exhausted, drained by the terror of the night. She didn't tell her husband about the ghost, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the house. The walls seemed thicker now, as though they held secrets too heavy to bear. Weeks later, Maggie discovered something. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, told the story of a woman who had lived in the house long before Maggie had moved in. The woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, her body never found. Some said she had died in the house, trapped in its walls, waiting for someone to come and set her free. But others said she was still there, watching, waiting for someone to take her place. Maggie never returned to the upstairs hallway. She couldn't, and every winter midnight when the wind howled and the snow piled deep, she would hear the soft footsteps above her once again. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was the winter of 2016 when I first experienced what I can only describe as a true encounter with the supernatural. I had just returned to my childhood home for the holidays. My parents had moved out years ago, leaving the old house empty, and I was staying there alone for a few days while visiting relatives in the area. The house sat on a quiet, rural road surrounded by dense woods. The small town I grew up in was often covered in snow during the winter months, and this was no exception. A thick blanket of snow had settled over everything, making the world feel eerily silent. It was a strange kind of stillness that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. I had spent the day unpacking and organizing a few things, reminiscing about my childhood, and going through old family photos. By the time the evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I decided to retire early for the night, curling up on the couch with a book, the fire crackling softly in the background. Outside, the wind howled against the windows and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. Around midnight, I began to feel that familiar sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, it was just an uncomfortable feeling, like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was simply the isolation getting to me. I had been in this house alone many times before, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just my imagination, but the air seemed unnaturally still, almost too quiet. I decided to turn in for the night. I made my way upstairs, flicking on the lights as I went. The old wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. I walked down the hallway toward the guest room where I was staying. As I passed the old master bedroom, I couldn't help but notice that the door was slightly ajar. My parents had kept that room locked for as long as I could remember. They said it was too cold in there, but I always thought it was because they didn't want me to explore it. I had never really given it much thought until that night, when I found the door slightly open. The strange thing was, I could swear I had locked the door earlier that evening when I was upstairs. It was a small detail, but it unsettled me. I brushed it off, though. After all, the wind could have pushed it open, or maybe I had forgotten to lock it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I entered the guest room, closed the door behind me, and climbed into bed. As I lay there in the dark, the house settled around me. The creaks of the floorboards, the faint rustling of wind outside, they were all familiar sounds. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, almost inaudible whispering coming from the hallway outside my room. It was low, distant, but unmistakably there. I sat up straight in bed, straining to hear. The whispering seemed to be coming from the direction of the master bedroom. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded almost as if someone was speaking to themselves, as if lost in conversation. My heart raced, and I began to feel that all too familiar sense of fear creeping up my spine. I told myself it was the wind or perhaps an animal outside, but deep down I knew that it wasn't. The sound was too specific, too deliberate. Suddenly, the whispering stopped and the silence was deafening. I sat there in the darkness, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. But nothing came. I glanced nervously at the door, then at the window, where the snow continued to fall heavily outside. The storm raged, but the house itself seemed almost too quiet. I must have drifted off to sleep because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate tread of boots across the wooden floor. But it wasn't just the sound of footsteps that terrified me. It was the fact that they were coming closer to my door. I heard them clearly, one step after another, the soft creak of the floorboards as they moved down the hallway toward my room. I held my breath, not daring to move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, and I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, or that I had imagined it. But then the door handle slowly turned. I could hear the faint scrape of metal against metal, as if someone was trying to open the door. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to shout, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there, my body stiff with fear. The door didn't open fully, but I could feel the pressure on the handle, as if someone was standing right there, just on the other side of the door. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure on the handle released, and the footsteps began to fade away down the hallway. I waited, my breath shallow and rapid, not daring to make a sound. The footsteps faded, and the house returned to its eerie stillness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. The fear had taken hold of me, and I knew that something wasn't right in that house. The next morning, I went downstairs, trying to act normal, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything. The storm outside had finally let up, and the world seemed strangely quiet as I looked out the window at the untouched snow. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. I went to the master bedroom. The one that I had noticed was open the night before. The door was still ajar. I stepped inside cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. The room was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. The same old furniture, the same dust-covered window. But something was different. On the floor, in the middle of the room, was a small patch of snow as someone had tracked it in from outside. I didn't know how it had gotten there. The windows were sealed tight, and there was no way for snow to have blown in. And yet there it was. A small, untouched patch of snow. That's when I saw it. On the wall, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a handprint. A handprint that had been left in the dust, as if someone had pressed their hand against the wall recently. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had not been alone in that house the night before. Someone had been there with me, and they weren't gone. I left the house that morning, not returning until I was sure the house was empty and quiet. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. The house was never truly empty. Something or someone was still there, waiting in the cold, watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The wind was relentless that night. It howled and groaned as it whipped through the trees outside the small cabin in the woods. The snow had been falling heavily for hours, blanketing the earth in a thick, silent layer of white. Inside, the cabin was warm, cozy even, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the low hum of a few lights offering a comforting glow. Lena sat by the fire, her thick woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a mug of hot chocolate warming her hands. She had come to this remote cabin for some peace and solitude, a break from the chaos of life. It had been a long year, and she had hoped that the winter retreat would help her recharge. The cabin was old, but not too old, just enough to have some character, with its creaky floorboards and the smell of pine and wood smoke lingering in the air. The isolation was part of its charm. It had been a gift from her late aunt, who had lived here alone for many years before passing away unexpectedly a few months ago. Lena had been hesitant at first to come here alone, but her aunt had always loved the cabin, and she couldn't bring herself to let it sit abandoned. As the night wore on, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the old cabin creak and groan. It was a sound Lena was getting used to, though part of her still found it unsettling. Her aunt had always said that the wind was just the trees shifting, the snow settling, but Lena wasn't so sure anymore. The longer she stayed in the cabin, the more she felt like something was watching her. She had told herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her, but as she sat there by the fire, the feeling wouldn't leave her. It was as though the cabin itself had a presence, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Lena glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after midnight. She sighed, setting down her mug and standing up to stretch. Her muscles ached from the long day of hiking in the snow, and she was ready to get some sleep. The wind outside had only intensified, howling like an animal in pain. She made her way to the bedroom at the back of the cabin, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping along her spine. She pulled the covers over herself and turned off the light, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside was louder now, almost deafening, and she could hear something else, something faint, a scraping sound like fingernails dragging across wood. She frowned, pulling the blanket tighter around her, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to come from somewhere above her, just out of reach, as though something or someone was pacing in the attic. The rational part of her mind told her it was just the wind. The old cabin settled in strange ways, and the snow outside could make all sorts of sounds. But as she lay in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the wind at all. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, growing louder and closer until it seemed to be right above her head. She sat up in bed, heart racing. Was someone in the attic? She knew she had locked all the doors, checked all the windows, but still the sound persisted. It was unmistakable now, footsteps, slow and heavy, dragging across the floor of the attic. Lena's mind raced. She knew she had to check it out. She couldn't just ignore it, couldn't lie to herself any longer. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe it was just a raccoon or some other animal in the attic looking for warmth. But as she sat there in the dark, the rational explanations didn't feel right. Her hands trembled as she reached for the flashlight beside her bed, and she crept quietly to the bedroom door. The house was eerily silent now, the footsteps having stopped just as suddenly as they had started. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house was no longer the safe retreat she had imagined. She stepped out into the narrow hallway, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air felt cold, colder than it had been a few hours ago. She moved slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, as she approached the attic stairs. The old wooden staircase creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the cabin. At the top of the stairs, Lena hesitated. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and the air that escaped from it was freezing. She pushed it open cautiously, the hinges squealing in protest, and stepped inside. The attic was dark, save for the dim light of her flashlight. It was a small, cramped space filled with old furniture, forgotten belongings, and boxes stacked high against the walls. There was no sign of anyone or anything up here. Lena moved slowly through the room, scanning the corners, the shadows, but she found nothing. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but there was no sound of footsteps, no scraping noise. The silence felt thick and suffocating, and Lena couldn't shake the sense that something was off. She turned to leave, but as she did, her flashlight caught something strange in the corner of the room, a dark shape, barely visible against the wall. Lena froze. At first she thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shape shifted. It was a figure hunched over, its back arched at an unnatural angle, its arms hanging limply at its sides. The shape was barely human, if at all. Lena's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward. And then it spoke. A whisper. So faint it was almost inaudible, yet it sent a chill down Lena's spine. "Get out!" Lena's heart slammed against her chest as she turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, her feet sliding on the creaky steps. She didn't stop until she was back in the bedroom, locked inside with the door shut tightly. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? Was it just the wind playing tricks on her? Or had she really seen something in the attic? For a long time, Lena sat in the dark, the only sound the furious wind outside. She couldn't bring herself to go back upstairs to face whatever it was that she had seen, or thought she had seen. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and every creak of the house seemed louder now, every gust of wind more threatening. Eventually, she fell into a fitful sleep, but her dreams were plagued with images of the dark figure in the attic, its haunting voice echoing in her mind. When she woke the next morning, the wind had died down and the cabin was eerily silent. The sun had risen, casting pale light through the window, but Lena didn't feel reassured. The cabin felt empty in a way that it hadn't before, like something was missing or something was waiting. Lena packed her things quickly and left the cabin that morning. She didn't look back, not even once, as she drove down the snow-covered road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When she reached the town, she stopped at a small diner for a cup of coffee, her nerves still rattled. The waitress who served her smiled politely, but stopped short when Lena mentioned she had been staying at the old cabin. "You know, people say that place is haunted," the waitress said casually, as if it were no big deal. "It was abandoned for years before your aunt moved in. Some folks say they've seen strange things up there, heard voices in the night." Lena's stomach twisted and she forced a smile. She wasn't sure what she believed anymore, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never return to that cabin again. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The snow had been falling steadily all day, blanketing the small mountain village in pristine white. By midnight, the world outside was silent, save for the occasional whistle of the icy wind weaving through the pine trees. Dev, a long-haul truck driver, found himself stranded on a remote mountain pass due to a sudden blizzard. His rig was stuck in a drift, and there was no signal on his phone to call for help. Dev cursed under his breath, pulling his jacket tighter as he stepped out of the cab. The cold was biting, almost alive, gnawing at his skin. His breath came out in thick clouds as he surveyed the desolate road. The narrow, winding stretch was treacherous even on clear days. Now, with snow piling up and visibility near zero, he knew he wouldn't be going anywhere until morning. A faint glow caught his eye in the distance. It came from a small wooden cabin just off the road, nestled against the edge of the forest. Relieved, he grabbed his flashlight and trudged through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching loudly in the otherwise eerie silence. As he approached, the cabin seemed oddly untouched by the storm. The snow on its roof and around its porch appeared undisturbed, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The single window emitted a soft golden light, casting shadows that flickered as though from a fire inside. Dev knocked on the door, his gloved hand making a hollow thud against the wood. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone in there? My truck's stuck, and I need some help." His voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the snow-covered landscape. The door creaked open on its own. Dev hesitated, shining his flashlight into the dark interior. The warmth of the cabin enveloped him as he stepped inside, a stark contrast to the freezing cold outside. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and a single chair sat in front of it, facing away from him. On the small wooden table nearby, a cup of tea steamed untouched. "Hello?" Dev called out again, feeling a growing unease. "Is anyone here?" The cabin was modest, with only one room. A bed with a patchwork quilt stood in one corner, and shelves lined the walls, cluttered with books and trinkets. But there was no sign of anyone. He stepped closer to the chair, expecting to find someone sitting in it. But it was empty. A chill ran down his spine, despite the warmth of the fire. The tea was still steaming, as though someone had just left it there moments ago. Dev felt as though he was being watched. His eyes darted around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the faint howling of the wind outside. He decided to wait until morning, reasoning that whoever lived here would return eventually. He pulled the chair closer to the fire and sat down, warming his hands. As the minutes ticked by, exhaustion began to creep in. The heat of the fire made his eyelids heavy, and he dozed off. He woke with a start to the sound of soft footsteps behind him. His heart pounded as he turned quickly, but the room was empty. The cabin felt different now, colder, darker. The fire had died down to embers, and the once steaming cup of tea was now frozen solid. Dev stood, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaky. A whisper answered him. It was faint, almost like a sigh, coming from the direction of the bed. He turned the beam of his flashlight toward it and froze. Lying on the bed was a figure wrapped in the quilt. At first, it looked like a person sleeping, but as Dev approached, he realized the body was unnaturally still. The face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes closed and lips slightly parted. It was a young woman, her features delicate and serene, as though she had simply fallen asleep. But there was no rise and fall of her chest. Dev stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and indistinct, like the wind carrying words from far away. The woman's eyes snapped open. They were milky white, and her gaze locked onto Dev with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Her lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was deep, guttural, and male. "Leave." Dev didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the snow. The wind howled louder, almost deafening, and the cabin's warm glow was now a pale, sickly green. He didn't look back as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he reached his truck, he climbed into the cab and locked the doors, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He sat there, staring at the faint outline of the cabin in the distance. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Dev stayed awake for the rest of the night, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As dawn broke, the blizzard began to ease, and he saw the faint beams of a snowplow approaching. Relief washed over him as he flagged it down. When he told the driver about the cabin, the man's expression turned grim. "There's no cabin up here," he said. "Hasn't been for decades. There used to be one, back in the 50s. A young couple lived there. She froze to death when she got lost in a storm. He went mad with grief and hung himself inside. They burned the place down after that." Dev insisted he'd seen it, even been inside, but the driver just shook his head. Storms play tricks on the mind, especially up here. As the plow cleared the road and Dev drove away, he couldn't shake the memory of the woman's lifeless eyes and the whispers that had filled the cabin. When he glanced in his rearview mirror one last time, he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure standing where the cabin had been. Story: the end.